For more than 200 years, archaeologists have searched the Ionian Islands for the world of Odysseus. And for most of those 200 years, the search has started with the same assumption. The modern island called Ithaca must contain the palace described in the Odyssey. Somewhere among its hills, bays, and springs, the house of Laertes and Odysseus was supposed to be waiting beneath the soil. The search has produced Bronze Age pottery, modest buildings, an extraordinary underground water installation, a small bay used by prehistoric mariners, and 2 later sanctuaries securely connected with the cult of Odysseus. But it has not produced a Mycenaean palace, or even a dense settlement one could call a center. There is no linear B archive, no monumental Bronze Age administrative complex, no organized Mycenaean cemetery comparable with those found on Kefalonia, the larger island across the channel. And nowhere on Ithaca has excavation yet revealed the dense concentration of buildings, tombs, and material wealth normally expected around the political center of a significant late Bronze Age kingdom. That does not mean that Ithaca was empty. It does not mean that its later identification with Odysseus was meaningless, and it certainly does not mean that archaeology has failed. It means that the relationship between landscape, legend, and material evidence is more complicated than the original palace hunters imagined. In this first part of the series, we will look only at Ithaca, what has actually been found, what has not, and how much of the island's Odyssean identity belongs to the Bronze Age, and how much was constructed centuries later. Modern archaeological exploration of Ithaca began, appropriately enough, with a copy of Homer in one hand and a map in the other. William Gell traveled across the island at the beginning of the 19th century, examining hills and ruins and assigning Homeric names with remarkable confidence. He believed he had located the palace of Odysseus. He had not, but the method was established. William Leake conducted early digging in 1806. Heinrich Schliemann visited in 1864, 1868, and 1878, fresh from his searches at Troy and Mycenae. He opened trenches at Aghios, Pelikata, Dexia, and the place now called the School of Homer. He found nothing that could reasonably be called the Palace of Odysseus. He never seriously doubted that he was on the correct island. The palace, he assumed, had simply escaped him. By the early 20th century, the search had expanded across the neighboring islands. The Dutch banker Adrian Gokoop financed Wilhelm Dorpveld, who eventually decided that Lefkada was Homer's Ithaca. Gokoop then turned his attention to Kefalonia, and argued that the larger island, particularly the Levatho Plain, had formed the center of Odysseus's kingdom. His money funded excavations that uncovered substantial Mycenaean cemeteries on Kefalonia. But the search still produced no palace. The British school at Athens returned to Ithaca in the 1930s with the stated aim of investigating the island's Homeric identity. W.A. Hurtley excavated at Pelikata and Tris Langades. Sylvia Benton worked at Polis Bay, Aghios, and elsewhere. They did not discover a royal center. Benton did, however, recover 12 or 13 geometric bronze tripods at Polis. Because the Phaeacians give Odysseus 13 tripods in Book 13 of the Odyssey, the resemblance became irresistible. Perhaps too irresistible. The history of Ithacan archaeology is filled with real discoveries that acquired Homeric interpretations faster than the evidence could support them. So let us begin again, not with the poem, but with the ground. The northern peninsula of Ithaca is where most of the island's credible Bronze Age evidence is concentrated. This long, mountainous finger of land points toward the western Greek mainland. Aphales, Phryx, and Polis Bay cut into its coastline, providing access to maritime routes running between Kefalonia, Lefkada, Epirus, and the Peloponnese. The archaeology shows that people lived and worked here during the Bronze Age. It does not yet show that they governed a kingdom from here. Pelikata is a low hill with views toward 3 bays. It is an attractive location, naturally defensible, and close to routes connecting the northern peninsula. People used the area from the early Bronze Age onward. When Hertley excavated there in the 1930s, he recovered Mycenaean material, particularly from the late Helladic Palatial period, the 14th and 13th centuries BC. But the settlement remains were modest. The walls that earlier travelers had confidently described as Cyclopean could not be securely assigned to the Mycenaean period. The buildings were small, and much of the material had been disturbed. Pelikata demonstrates occupation. It does not demonstrate a palace. Hertley continued to believe that Odysseus's residence must have stood somewhere nearby. His interpretation survived more successfully than the architecture supporting it. A short distance away lies Langades, the most substantial, securely documented Mycenaean domestic site yet excavated on Ithaca. Here the British school found successive curved dry stone walls, probably supporting mud brick superstructures. There were traces of pebble paving and a small group of associated spaces. The pottery extended from late Helladic IIIA into early IIIB. It included kilikis, goblets, and a crater fragment with parallels at Mycenae. There were also examples of handmade pottery with connections to northern Greece, Epirus, and Albania. This is significant. It places northern Ithaca within a maritime network extending beyond the central Aegean. But the scale must remain clear. Langades was not an administrative center. It appears to have been a small farmstead or household complex with related outbuildings. That is not evidence of isolation or poverty. A household could participate in long-distance exchange without being part of a palace. But it is still a household, not the center of a large kingdom. And this small complex remains the clearest Mycenaean domestic architecture yet found on the island. Sit with that for a moment. The site that has generated the greatest excitement stands on the slopes of Mount Aghios. Aghios Athanassios has been known since the 19th century by the magnificent name School of Homer. It commands wide views over northern Ithaca and is supplied by nearby springs. Schliemann investigated it. The British school worked there. Excavations by Athanassios Papadopoulos and Litsa Kontorli Papadopoulou between 1994 and 2011 drew international attention. Since 2018, the University of Ioannina team under Yanos Lolos has been reassessing the remains systematically. The visible monument at the center of the site is not Mycenaean. It is a carefully built Hellenistic tower complex constructed in the 3rd century BC. The Bronze Age evidence is real, but limited. The total Mycenaean ceramic assemblage represents fragments from roughly 30 vessels, principally of the late 14th and 13th centuries BC. These meager finds do establish some level of Bronze Age activity on the hillside, but they do not by themselves establish a significant household, let alone a large settlement. The most extraordinary prehistoric feature is an underground corbelled water installation, approximately 200 meters below the main complex. Its construction required technical skill and organized labor. Mycenaean pottery was recovered from the area, supporting a Bronze Age date for at least part of the installation. Earlier excavators suggested that the wider site might contain a Mycenaean palace. The more cautious conclusion reached by the current archaeological team is that the Bronze Age remains represent a functional installation, perhaps concerned with water, movement, and the monitoring of maritime routes. That is important. Engineering competence is evidence of engineering competence. It is not automatically evidence of kingship. In 2022, at a public presentation on Ithaca, the excavators described the Bronze Age site as a functional installation rather than a palace. The reaction was intense. The phrase, "School of Homer," had already done decades of interpretive work before archaeology was allowed to speak for itself. Then, in 2025, the site produced an entirely different kind of confirmation. Study of material from the Hellenistic complex, 1,000 years after the Mycenaean era, identified 2 inscriptions bearing the name of Odysseus. One was a seal impression preserving the genitive form of his name. The other was an incised dedication, probably addressed to Odysseus in the dative. These finds securely identify the later complex as the Odysseion of Ithaca, a public shrine of Odysseus, used for cult, assembly, and pilgrimage during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. This is a major discovery, but it does not identify a Mycenaean palace. Aghios Athanassios has at least two distinct archaeological histories. In the late Bronze Age, it contained a technically impressive but comparatively modest functional installation, a well. Roughly 1,000 years later, it became a monumental sanctuary in which the inhabitants of Ithaca publicly honored Odysseus. Those phases may have been connected through local memory. The later builders may have selected a place already known to contain ancient structures. But archaeological continuity cannot simply be assumed. The Mycenaean installation and the Hellenistic Odysseion are both real. They are not the same thing. At the western edge of Polis Bay is the place traditionally called the Cave of the Nymphs, or the Cave of the Tripods. But even the word cave now requires qualification. Earlier excavators believed that the roof had collapsed sometime after the Roman period. Recent geological study has overturned that reconstruction. The site appears never to have been a fully enclosed cave. It was more probably an open alcove or rock shelter at the base of the cliff. That matters because the physical character of the place influenced its interpretation. A mysterious collapsed cave seems naturally suited to hidden ritual. An open shelter beside a harbor suggests a wider range of practical uses. Volgraph recovered late Helladic sherds there in 1905, the first Mycenaean pottery then recognized on Ithaca. Benton's excavations between 1930 and 1932 produced a longer prehistoric sequence than is sometimes acknowledged. There are 3 or 4 possible fragments from the earlier Mycenaean period, and a number of restorable vessels ranging from late Helladic IIIA2 through IIIC. But the archaeological contexts are difficult. Much of the prehistoric pottery was recovered from within a curved wall constructed in the 3rd century BC. The limited surviving stratigraphy included late Bronze Age, protogeometric, and coarse pottery together. The largest body of pre-geometric material was actually protogeometric, so Polis preserves repeated activity over a long period. It does not preserve a simple, undisturbed sequence. The older interpretation treated the drinking vessels, chelikes, cups, and bowls, as evidence of communal ritual, and identified Polis as a late Bronze Age cult place. Recent scholarship has rejected that conclusion. The vessels can be understood more practically. Polis Bay was the natural western approach to northern Ithaca, located within the small maritime world shared by Ithaca, Kefalonia, and the western mainland. Suyudzoglu Haywood interprets the place as a point of interaction used by mariners, somewhere to obtain supplies, store provisions, and consume food and drink while moving between the islands. In other words, the Bronze Age activity at Polis may have been maritime rather than cultic, a larger island, Kefalonia, supporting a smaller island, Ithaca. That does not make the site insignificant, quite the opposite. The pottery from Ithaca and Kefalonia shows close affinities in style and production. The two islands shared forms of handmade pottery, weapon types, and curvilinear building traditions. People almost certainly crossed the channel regularly, carrying goods, knowledge, family connections, and stories. Polis may have been one of the places where that contact happened. Its religious character becomes much clearer later. From the geometric period onward, over a century after the Mycenaean era, the offerings multiplied. Pottery, bronze weapons, figurines, and the famous group of 12 or 13 bronze tripod cauldrons. Every reader of Book 13 of the Odyssey feels the attraction immediately. Before returning Odysseus to Ithaca, the Phaeacians give him 13 tripods. Archaeologists then found almost the same number at a sanctuary beside Polis Bay, but these significantly post-date the Mycenaean era. It is a remarkable correspondence. But correspondence is not identification. In the sanctuary's later history, the connection becomes explicit. Inscriptions associate the place with the Nymphs, Odysseus, and the IIIA games celebrated in his honor. Polis therefore preserves at least two different stories. First, a prehistoric place of maritime interaction, provisioning, and consumption. Later, an important sanctuary that became explicitly connected with Odysseus. The connection is genuine. However, continuous Odyssean worship from the Bronze Age onward has not been demonstrated anywhere on Ithaca. The archaeological picture becomes thinner as we move south. At the narrow saddle of Aitos, the island contracts into its familiar hourglass form. The location was so strategically attractive that William Gell identified it as the site of Odysseus's palace around 1800. Schliemann agreed and excavated there in 1868 and 1878. He found no prehistoric palace. Systematic work by the British school in the 1930s established what Aitos primarily was, the site of the later Greek city of Al-Alkamenai, with substantial protogeometric, geometric, archaic, and classical activity. A small quantity of Mycenaean pottery has been found there, fragments of calyx, bowls, jars, a probable figurine and other sherds, some dating to LH3b and LH3c. Later excavations also proposed that a few walls or buildings might be Mycenaean, but the evidence remains fragmentary. The pottery is sparse, often poorly preserved, and generally overshadowed by the much greater volume of later material. No securely identified Mycenaean palace has emerged. Recent rescue excavation in the modern town of Vathi has added a few more pieces to the southern picture. Mycenaean sherds were recovered alongside Neolithic and geometric pottery, including fragments of calyx and craters. These finds are useful because they establish Mycenaean activity around the enclosed harbor. But once again, activity is not the same as an organized political center. The south of Ithaca contains traces of Bronze Age presence. It does not presently contain the concentrated settlement evidence required for a palace. After 2 centuries of excavation, the evidence can be stated without either dismissing Ithaca or exaggerating it. Yes, the island was inhabited during the Mycenaean period. Its northern peninsula contained small domestic and functional sites. Pelikata and Tris Langades demonstrate settlement and participation in wider maritime networks. Aghios Athanassios preserves an impressive water installation and evidence of organized technical labor. Polis Bay served as a place of prehistoric activity and maritime interaction. Aitos and Vathi add scattered evidence in the south. But no known site on Ithaca currently demonstrates the population density, administrative apparatus, or monumental funerary landscape expected around the center of a substantial Mycenaean kingdom. There are no securely identified Mycenaean tholos tombs. There is no organized late Bronze Age cemetery comparable with those on Kefalonia. There is no concentration of seal stones suggesting administration. There is no palace complex. There is no Linear B archive. The island's later connection with Odysseus, however, is beyond dispute. Polis became an important sanctuary from the geometric period onward, and was eventually associated explicitly with Odysseus and the Odyssea. Aghios Athanassios became the monumental Odysseon of Ithaca in the Hellenistic period, 1,000 years after the Mycenaean era. These sites demonstrate that the Ithacans of the historical period claimed Odysseus as their own hero and embedded him deeply within their civic and religious identity. What they do not demonstrate is that a Mycenaean king named Odysseus lived at either site. This distinction matters because later cult can preserve very ancient memory, but it can also create memory. Communities select old ruins, ancient tombs, and striking landscapes, and connect them with the heroes they need. That process was common throughout the Greek world. It does not make the resulting cult fraudulent. It makes the cult historical. The people of Ithaca were not deceiving anyone when they worshipped Odysseus. They were expressing who they believed themselves to be. The archaeological question is whether that belief descended continuously from the Bronze Age or emerged through the interaction of epic, politics, and local landscape during the early historical period. At present, the material evidence cannot settle that question. There is another uncertainty beneath the entire discussion. We do not know what the island was called during the Bronze Age. The name Ithaca is established in the Homeric tradition, but the epics reached their surviving form centuries after the Mycenaean palace system disappeared. During those centuries, populations moved, political centers changed, and geographical names could migrate. The earliest surviving external descriptions securely identifying the small island beside Kefalonia as Ithaca belong to the historical period. Claus Ransborg therefore raised a provocative possibility that the name Ithaca may once have referred to a region of Kefalonia and was transferred to the modern island during the period of Corinthian commercial expansion in the Ionian Sea. This remains a hypothesis, not an archaeological conclusion. But later mythology shows that powerful cities were willing to compete over Odysseus. A post-Homeric tradition made him the biological son of Sisyphus of Corinth, rather than Laertes. Homer knows nothing of this version. It appears later, when Corinth had become a major maritime power with strong interests in the Western Greek world. It could have been a Corinthian attempt to appropriate Odysseus and make the Ionian hero partly Corinthian. The attempt did not succeed. Laertes remained his father in the dominant tradition, and Ithaca retained its hero. But the episode reminds us that mythological geography was never politically innocent. Cities used heroes to claim territory, ancestry, and prestige. The later sanctuaries on Ithaca belong within that contested world of memory. The end of the Bronze Age did not leave Ithaca isolated. The pottery tells a more dynamic story. Suyudzoglu Haywood has argued that Ithacan protogeometric pottery developed from traditions shared with the late and post-palatial communities of Kefalonia. The volume and style of the material may indicate movement by potters, and perhaps settlers, from Kefalonia to Ithaca during the transition out of the Bronze Age. Polis Bay gained importance at approximately this time. The relationship was not simply one of influence traveling from the larger island to the smaller. Ithacan potters subsequently helped develop the shared regional style, and some forms of influence traveled back toward Kefalonia. The two islands remained in conversation across the channel. People carried pottery techniques, ritual practices, and stories with them. That may be the most important conclusion of this first part. The archaeology does not support a sharp opposition between Homeric Ithaca and an unrelated Kefalonia. These were neighboring communities within a closely connected maritime world. But they were not equal in scale. On Ithaca, Bronze Age evidence is modest and dispersed. Across the water, the archaeological record changes dramatically. There are extensive chamber tomb cemeteries, tholos tombs, seal stones, gold, amber, and imported glass from Egypt and the Near East. Settlements that expanded after the collapse of the mainland palaces. And at Sanata, the largest Mycenaean vaulted tomb in western Greece. More recently, excavation above the Livatho plain has uncovered a monument unlike anything previously known in the region. A monument discovered by the author using a predictive analysis that began at a nearby Bronze Age cemetery. Any serious attempt to understand the Ionian background of the Odyssey must begin by looking beyond the modern island bearing the name. 2 centuries of archaeology on Ithaca have not uncovered the palace people expected. That is not a failure of archaeology, it is a result. And in part 2, we cross the channel to see what the ground has produced on Kefalonia.